She said, her voice tight with controlled fear that she was clearly fighting to suppress. The coffee shop. She stopped, her brilliant mind clearly processing at accelerated pace. This was trap. You knew. Oh God, you're working with them. This was elaborate setup too. To save your life, Leo interrupted, crouching down to her eye level with movement that was deliberately non-threatening despite circumstances. Though I can see how you might interpret it differently given that you're currently restrained and surrounded by armed operatives who just killed multiple people. Who are you? Evelyn demanded, her eyes scanning his face with the same systematic attention she probably used examining crime scenes. Really? Because you're not random stranger from coffee shop any more than tonight was legitimate meeting. Dr. Evelyn Reed had learned long ago that the dead spoke more truth than the living ever would. They couldn't lie, couldn't manipulate evidence, couldn't construct elaborate alibis to hide their final moments. Blood spatter told stories of violence with mathematical precision. Bone fragments revealed the force and angle of impact. Chemical residue whispered secrets about weapons and toxins that murderers thought they'd hidden. In the sterile silence of her laboratory at the Metropolitan Police Department's Forensic Division, Evelyn had built a career on listening to what corpses had to say, and today they were screaming a name that made even hardened detectives go pale with fear. Leonardo Rossi. The evidence spread across her examination table told a story 3 years in the making. A cold case that had been gathering dust in the archives until Evelyn had requested it specifically, drawn by inconsistencies in the original investigation that suggested deliberate misdirection rather than simple incompetence. The victim, Marcus Chin, low-level accountant with no criminal history, had been found in his apartment with 2 bullets in his chest and his financial records burned in the bathtub. The official conclusion had been robbery gone wrong, case closed, file forgotten. But Evelyn didn't believe in coincidence, and she certainly didn't believe that professional accountants kept backup financial records hidden inside hollowed-out law textbooks unless those records contained information worth dying for. The encrypted flash drive she discovered during her reinvestigation of the crime scene, overlooked by the original team because it had been vacuum-sealed inside a bag of coffee beans in Chen's freezer, had taken her 6 months to crack. What she'd found had made her blood run cold with the kind of focused fury that came from realizing someone had committed perfect murder and nearly gotten away with it. Money laundering. Millions of dollars flowing through shell corporations with connections that spiderwebbed through the city's entire financial infrastructure. And at the center of that web, mentioned in encrypted communications with careful obliqueness that suggested everyone involved knew better than to use his full name, Leo. Just Leo. But Evelyn had cross-referenced dates and locations and transaction amounts until the pattern became undeniable. Leonardo Rossi. The untouchable king of the city's most sophisticated criminal empire. The man who'd inherited his father's organization at 25 and transformed it from street-level violence into corporate-level manipulation. The ghost who moved through society's upper echelons with donations to children's hospitals and attendance at charity galas while simultaneously controlling drug distribution, weapons trafficking, and protection rackets that generated revenue exceeding some small nation's GDP. Everyone knew what Rossi was. No one could prove it. Witnesses disappeared or recanted testimony. Evidence vanished from lockup. Prosecutors who got too close found their careers mysteriously derailed by scandals or health crises that forced early retirement. The Rossi name was synonymous with power so absolute it had become functionally immune to legal consequence. Until now. Until Evelyn had found the DNA. It was microscopic, barely enough for analysis, but it had been there on the flash drive's casing, mixed with coffee residue and preserved by 3 years of freezer storage. European ancestry. And when she'd run it through the national database hoping for impossible luck, she'd gotten a partial match to a sample collected years ago during a legitimate traffic stop, before Leonardo Rossi had become untouchable enough that such routine interactions no longer occurred. Partial match meant family connection. Partial match meant she couldn't arrest him based on this evidence alone. But partial match also meant she had thread to pull, lead to follow, crack in the armor that had protected the Rossi empire for generations. "You're playing with fire," Chief Davidson had said when she'd presented her preliminary findings that morning, his weathered face creased with concern that went beyond professional obligation. "The Rossi family has destroyed better detectives than you, Evelyn. Smarter investigators. People with more resources and political backing. What makes you think you'll succeed where they failed? Because they were trying to build cases on witness testimony and financial trails that Rossi controlled," Evelyn had replied calmly, her hand steady despite the way her pulse had accelerated with anticipation of the hunt. "I'm building mine on evidence that can't be intimidated or bribed. Blood doesn't lie, Chief. DNA doesn't forget. And physics doesn't care how much money you have or how many politicians you own. Davidson had sighed with the exhaustion of someone who'd seen too many good cops become casualties of ambition. This is career suicide, Dr. Reed. Maybe actual suicide if Rossi decides you're enough of a threat. I can't officially support an investigation targeting him without more concrete evidence than partial DNA match and encrypted files from a cold case. You're on your own with this one. I've always worked better alone, Evelyn had said, which was truth that extended far beyond professional methodology. She'd learned early that relationships were liabilities in her line of work. You couldn't maintain normal social connections when you spent 12-hour shifts elbow-deep in decomposition and violent death. Couldn't explain to civilian partners why you found more comfort in the predictable logic of forensic analysis than in the messy emotional complexity of human interaction. Couldn't reconcile the person who attended dinner parties and made small talk with the person who could catalog the specific wounds that indicated torture versus rage killing with clinical detachment. So Evelyn had stopped trying. Had built life that consisted entirely of her laboratory, her apartment with its wall of case files and forensic journals, and the occasional academic conference where she could discuss blood spatter velocities without seeing horror in people's eyes. It was isolated existence, but isolation meant focus. Meant she could pursue cases like this one without worrying about collateral damage to people she cared about. Because Chief Davidson was right about one thing, pursuing Leonardo Rossi was dangerous. The kind of dangerous that got investigators killed in ways that looked like accidents or suicides or random street violence that just happened to occur at statistically improbable moments. But Evelyn had stopped caring about danger around the same time she'd stopped caring about normal human connection. She cared about truth, about justice, about ensuring that people who thought themselves above the law learned that forensic evidence didn't recognize hierarchies of power. Now, 12 hours after her conversation with Davidson, Evelyn was standing in an abandoned warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, her forensic kit heavy in her gloved hands, staring at a crime scene that made her pulse spike with the focused intensity that came from recognizing significant discovery. The body had been found by a security guard doing routine patrol. Male, mid-30s, execution-style bullet wound to the back of the head, no identification, no personal effects, nothing that would make investigation easy or straightforward. But Evelyn didn't need easy. She needed evidence. And this scene was practically screaming with it. The blood spatter pattern was wrong for simple execution. There were signs of struggle, scuff marks in the dust, displaced shipping containers, bullet holes in walls that suggested return fire before the victim had gone down. The killer had been professional but not perfect. Had left shell casings behind despite clearly having time to clean the scene. Had positioned the body in a way that suggested message rather than mere disposal. This was territory dispute. This was organizational violence. This was exactly the kind of crime that pointed towards syndicate involvement, and Evelyn's instincts, honed by 15 years of forensic investigation, were screaming that she was looking at Rossi organization work. She was cataloging blood samples when she felt it. That prickling awareness at the base of her skull that had nothing to do with forensic evidence and everything to do with primal human instinct for being observed. Evelyn froze, her gloved hand hovering over the collection swab, her breathing controlled despite the sudden spike of adrenaline flooding her system. Someone was watching her. Someone close enough that she should be able to see them, but the warehouse was empty except for her forensic team working near the entrance. Someone whose presence felt focused and intentional and absolutely deliberate. She turned slowly, scanning shadows and corners with systematic precision, her free hand moving automatically toward the service weapon she carried despite primarily being scientist rather than field agent. Nothing. No movement, no sound, no visible threat. Just the oppressive weight of attention so intense it felt almost physical. Dr. Reed? One of her junior technicians called from across the warehouse. We've got tire tracks near the loading dock. Look recent. Evelyn forced herself to move toward the technician, to focus on tangible evidence rather than atmospheric sensation, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it intensified, like whatever presence had been observing her was now actively following her movements, tracking her with the kind of patient focus that predators reserved for particularly interesting prey. By the time she'd finished processing the scene 4 hours later, exhaustion had replaced adrenaline, and Evelyn had almost convinced herself the watched feeling had been paranoia or fatigue. Almost. But as she loaded her evidence cases into her department vehicle and prepared to head back to the lab, she noticed something that made her breath catch. A black luxury sedan was parked 3 buildings down, expensive and out of place in this industrial wasteland, its tinted windows revealing nothing about any occupants. It hadn't been there when she'd arrived. Hadn't been visible during her initial scan of the area. But now it sat like patient sentinel, and Evelyn knew with bone-deep certainty that whoever was inside had been watching her work. She took photo with her phone, zoomed to capture the license plate, and added it to the growing file she was building on Rossi organization vehicles. Then she got in her own car and drove away with careful attention to her mirrors, waiting to see if the sedan would follow. It didn't. Or if it did, the driver was skilled enough to avoid detection. Either option was equally unsettling. Back at her laboratory, Evelyn processed evidence with the kind of meticulous attention that had made her reputation as one of the country's top forensic investigators. Shell casings went to ballistics. Blood samples to serology. Trace evidence to chemical analysis. Every piece carefully documented, every chain of custody form signed in triplicate, every observation recorded with clinical precision that would withstand courtroom scrutiny. The blood work came back first, and what Evelyn found made her pulse spike with vindication. The victim's DNA was in the system, low-level enforcer for a rival organization, exactly the kind of person who might find themselves on the wrong end of territorial dispute. But more importantly, there were trace amounts of secondary DNA in the blood samples. Touch DNA transferred during the struggle, belonging to at least 2 other individuals. One partial profile matched the database. Street soldier with priors for assault and weapons charges, known Rossi associate. The other was unknown, but sophisticated enough to suggest professional criminal rather than amateur. Evelyn was comparing the unknown profile to her growing database of Rossi-connected samples when her phone rang with internal extension number. Dr. Reed, she answered, her attention still focused on the DNA sequencing software. You have a visitor in the lobby, the security desk informed her. Says he has information about your warehouse case. Won't give a name, but he's very insistent that he speak with you specifically. Evelyn's instincts immediately flagged this as suspicious. Witnesses didn't typically show up at police headquarters after midnight. Legitimate informants went through official channels. And anyone connected to the Rossi organization would know better than to walk voluntarily into law enforcement facility. Tell him I'll be down in 5 minutes, she said, already securing her evidence and locking her laboratory with the kind of paranoid thoroughness that came from working cases where evidence had tendency to disappear. And have someone from security meet me in the lobby. This could be hostile contact. Understood, Dr. Reed. The lobby was empty except for the night security guard and a single man sitting in the waiting area with the kind of relaxed patience that suggested absolute confidence in his safety despite being inside police headquarters. He was younger than Evelyn had expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair swept back from a face that belonged in fashion magazines rather than criminal investigations. Expensive suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Hands that were manicured but not soft, suggesting someone who was equally comfortable in boardrooms and more physical environments. He looked up when she entered, and Evelyn felt her breath catch at the intensity of his gaze. Dark eyes that assessed her with the same systematic precision she used when examining crime scenes. Intelligence that was immediately obvious in the way he tracked her movements, catalogued her body language, calculated exact distance between them. This was predator. This was threat. This was someone extremely dangerous pretending to be civilized. Dr. Reed, he said, standing with fluid grace that suggested extensive physical training. His voice was smooth, cultured, with faint accent she couldn't quite place. Thank you for seeing me so late. I know this is irregular, but I have information about your investigation that I thought you'd want to hear directly rather than through official channels. I don't discuss active investigations with civilians, Evelyn replied, her voice professionally cool despite the way her pulse had accelerated. If you have information about a crime, you can file a report with. I'm not here to file a report, the man interrupted gently. I'm here to give you a warning. You're pursuing something dangerous, Dr. Reed. Following trails that lead to places where forensic investigators don't typically survive to present their findings. I'd hate to see someone with your brilliance become another unsolved case in your own department's files. The threat was delivered so politely it took Evelyn a moment to process it fully. Are you threatening me? She asked, her hand moving automatically toward her weapon. I'm warning you, he corrected, taking a step closer despite the security guard's immediate tensing. There's a difference. A threat implies I intend harm. A warning suggests I'd prefer you avoid harm by making smarter choices. Choices like abandoning investigations into people who are significantly more dangerous than your evidence suggests. And which dangerous people would those be? Evelyn challenged, her mind racing through possibilities. This man was too clean to be street-level criminal, too confident to be simple messenger. Which meant he was either Rossi organization management or... "You're a brilliant investigator, Dr. Reed," the man said, his slight smile suggesting he knew exactly what she was thinking. "I'm sure you can figure that out on your own. Though I'd recommend doing so from the safety of your laboratory rather than continuing to investigate crime scenes in abandoned warehouses." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing, you felt someone watching you today at the warehouse. That instinct was correct. Consider it professional courtesy that whoever was watching chose observation over intervention. Next time you might not be so fortunate." Then he was gone, disappeared into the night with the kind of smooth exit that suggested extensive practice, and Evelyn was left standing in the lobby with her heart hammering and her mind spinning through implications. Security guard reviewed the camera footage at her request, but it yielded nothing useful. The man's face was visible but unremarkable in ways that suggested either surgical alteration or simply genetic luck in being difficult to remember clearly. He'd arrived on foot, left the same way, hadn't touched anything that might yield fingerprints. Professional. Careful. Exactly the kind of visit that was meant to intimidate without providing evidence of intimidation. Evelyn returned to her laboratory with renewed determination burning in her chest. They'd sent someone to warn her off, which meant she was close. Meant her investigation was threatening enough to warrant direct contact. Meant that whoever Leonardo Rossi was, he was worried about what she might uncover. Good. Let him be worried. Let him feel the same focused intensity of being hunted that his victims must have felt. Because Evelyn Reed didn't respond to threats by backing down, she responded by working harder, digging deeper, building cases so airtight that even the city's most powerful criminal couldn't escape justice. She pulled up everything she had on Leonardo Rossi and spread it across her computer screens like digital crime scene. Photographs from society pages showing a man who looked nothing like the dangerous criminal she knew him to be, handsome in that refined way that came from generations of genetic privilege, always photographed at charity events or cultural institutions, always with beautiful women on his arm who looked at him like he was fascinating rather than frightening. But Evelyn had learned to look past surface presentation. Had trained herself to see the truth that physical evidence revealed regardless of how prettily it was packaged. And looking at Leonardo Rossi's photographs with forensic rather than aesthetic eye, she saw things that civilian observers would miss. The way he positioned himself at events to maintain visual control of all entry points. The barely visible bulge under expensive suits that suggested concealed weapons. The pattern of attendance at functions that corresponded with known criminal activity in those same locations within days or weeks. The associates who appeared in background of photographs, faces that matched her database of known organized crime members. Leonardo Rossi was ghost who moved through legitimate society while orchestrating criminal empire. Was predator who wore expensive suits and donated to children's hospitals while ordering executions and money laundering operations. Was exactly the kind of sophisticated criminal that traditional investigation methods failed to catch because he existed in the space between legal business and organized crime where evidence was deliberately ambiguous. But DNA wasn't ambiguous. Blood spatter didn't care about charitable donations. And Evelyn was going to prove that even ghosts left traces that forensic science could follow straight to conviction. She was so focused on her analysis that she didn't notice the time passing, didn't register the laboratory growing cold as night deepened toward dawn, didn't realize she was being observed again until she happened to glance at the window and saw a reflection that made her blood freeze. A figure stood on the building across from the police headquarters. Too far away to identify clearly but close enough that she could see the posture of someone watching her laboratory with focused attention. They held something that might have been camera with telephoto lens or possibly long-range rifle scope. The silhouette was ambiguous in the darkness. Evelyn's hand moved toward her phone to call security, but by the time she turned away from the window and back, the figure had vanished. Disappeared so completely it was like they'd never existed. But they had existed. Had been watching her work the same way someone had watched her at the warehouse. Had been bold enough to do so from position where she might see them, which suggested either arrogance or deliberate intimidation. Evelyn saved all her files, backed them up to encrypted servers in 3 separate locations, and finally allowed herself to acknowledge the exhaustion pulling at her consciousness. It was 4 in the morning. She'd been awake for 22 hours. She needed sleep if she was going to continue this investigation with the kind of meticulous attention it required. But as she drove home through empty city streets, checking her mirrors compulsively for tails she couldn't quite spot, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just entered into some kind of dangerous game with an opponent who was significantly more skilled than anyone she'd faced before. Leonardo Rossi was watching her. Studying her. trying to determine whether she was actual threat or just another investigator who would ultimately be neutralized through intimidation or more permanent methods. Let him watch, Evelyn thought with grim satisfaction as she finally reached her apartment and engaged all 3 deadbolts on her reinforced door. Let him study her. Let him underestimate her because she was scientist rather than street cop, woman rather than man, civilian rather than soldier. Because while he was watching her, she was building case that would destroy everything he'd built. And Evelyn Reed didn't fail. She didn't give up. She didn't let dangerous men frighten her away from pursuing justice. She was the hunter. He was the prey. And sooner or later she would catch him. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed, was that Leonardo Rossi was thinking exactly the same thing about her. Meanwhile, across the city in a penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline like throne rooms surveying kingdom, Leonardo Rossi stood at his window with glass of expensive whiskey and watched security footage from the warehouse on tablet in his other hand. He'd been there. Had watched the forensic investigator work with focused intensity that he found simultaneously fascinating and irritating. Had wanted to see up close what kind of person was foolish enough to pursue him with such single-minded determination. What he'd found was a woman who looked nothing like the threat she represented. Mid-30s he estimated. Attractive and understated way that suggested she didn't spend much time thinking about her appearance. Hair pulled back in efficient ponytail that exposed elegant neck. Glasses that were probably unnecessary given how she pushed them up unconsciously, nervous habit rather than vision correction. Body language that spoke of confidence in her expertise but wariness about physical vulnerability. She'd felt him watching. Had turned to scan the warehouse with systematic precision that suggested either training or excellent instincts. Had almost spotted his position before his security team had signaled for him to withdraw. She's good, Matteo, his head of security, had reported after they'd left. Better than the other investigators who've tried building cases. More thorough. More patient. And she's not intimidated by your name, which makes her significantly more dangerous than the rest. Leo had known that already. Had known it from the moment his informants had told him that Dr. Evelyn Reed had requested the Chin cold case specifically. Had known it when she'd cracked encryption that should have been unbreakable. Had known it when she'd ignored her chief's warnings and continued pursuing leads that pointed directly toward Rossi organization involvement. What he hadn't expected was to find her so fascinating. So compelling in her focused determination. So absolutely unaware of how dangerous she was making herself with every piece of evidence she collected. He should eliminate her. Should make her disappear the way he'd disappeared other threats to his organization. Should ensure that her investigation died with her and all her carefully collected evidence burned to ash in memory. But Leo found himself reluctant to give that order. Found himself wanting to see how close she could get before he had to intervene. Found himself curious about whether Dr. Evelyn Reed would be smart enough to recognize when she was outmatched, or whether she'd push forward until pushing became fatal mistake. Send Marcus to warn her off, he'd instructed Matteo. Polite visit. Professional courtesy. Let her know that we're aware of her investigation and that continuing it would be extremely unwise. And if she doesn't take the warning? Matteo had asked. Leo had smiled then, cold and predatory and absolutely certain. Then we'll see exactly how brilliant she really is. Whether her forensic skills are enough to keep her alive when the evidence she's collecting points directly at me. Now, watching footage of her working in her laboratory with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested this was more than job to her, this was calling, purpose, possibly the only thing that gave her life meaning, Leo felt something shift in his understanding of the threat she represented. Dr. Evelyn Reed wasn't pursuing him because of career ambition or political motivation. She was pursuing him because she genuinely believed in justice. Believed that her evidence mattered. Believed that even powerful men could be brought down by forensic science and patient determination. She was dangerous precisely because she was incorruptible. Because she couldn't be bought or threatened or seduced away from her investigation. Because she was willing to risk everything, including her life, to ensure that truth was revealed regardless of cost. Leo should have found that threatening. Should have responded with the kind of ruthless elimination that had kept his organization secure for years. Instead he found himself intrigued, challenged, almost excited by the idea of opponent who couldn't be easily neutralized. Let's see how close you get, Dr. Reed, he murmured to himself, his reflection in the window showing slight smile that his enemies would have recognized as extremely dangerous. Let's see if your brilliance is enough to catch a ghost. And let's see what happens when the hunter realizes she's been the prey all along. He finished his whiskey and turned away from the window, already planning his next move in game that was becoming significantly more interesting than he'd anticipated. Dr. Evelyn Reed wanted to hunt him? Fine. He'd let her hunt. Would watch her work, study her methods, learn everything there was to know about the woman who thought she could destroy his empire with blood samples and DNA evidence. And when the time came, when she'd gotten close enough to be real threat but not close enough to actually succeed, he'd show her exactly why Leonardo Rossi had remained untouchable for so many years. Because the thing about hunters was that they sometimes forgot they weren't the only predators in the forest. And the thing about forensic investigators was that they spent so much time studying the dead that they forgot the living could be infinitely more dangerous. Dr. Evelyn Reed was brilliant, determined, absolutely committed to bringing him down. But Leo was patient, strategic, and absolutely fascinated by the idea of destroying someone so committed to destroying him. This was going to be interesting. The coffee shop was Evelyn's sanctuary, one of the few locations in her carefully controlled life where she allowed herself to exist as something other than forensic investigator on mission. It was a small establishment tucked between a bookstore and a pharmacy, frequented by neighborhood regulars who knew better than to bother the serious woman who always sat in the corner booth with her laptop and case files spread across the table like battlefield strategy maps. The owner kept her favorite blend stocked specifically for her weekly visits, and the baristas had learned that Dr. Reed didn't appreciate small talk but always tipped generously for respecting her need for isolated focus. Today, 3 weeks after the warehouse investigation, Evelyn desperately needed that sanctuary. Her case against Leonardo Rossi was building with agonizing slowness, DNA evidence that pointed toward organization involvement but not directly at him, financial trails that disappeared into offshore accounts and shell corporations, witnesses who either vanished or suddenly developed convenient amnesia about anything they might have seen. She was making progress, but it was measured in millimeters rather than miles, and the pressure from her department to either produce actionable evidence or abandon the investigation entirely was becoming harder to ignore. Chief Davidson had called her into his office that morning with expression that suggested bad news delivered with reluctant necessity. "The district attorney reviewed your preliminary findings," he'd said without preamble. "She says you don't have enough for warrant, let alone indictment. Says pursuing Rossi without concrete evidence linking him directly to criminal activity is wasting resources on vendetta that's going nowhere." "It's not a vendetta," Evelyn had replied, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "It's investigation based on forensic evidence that clearly indicates." "That indicates Rossi organization involvement," Davidson had interrupted. "Not Leonardo Rossi himself. There's difference, Evelyn. Legal difference that matters in court. You need something that ties him personally to criminal activity. Photographs of him at crime scenes. Testimony from witnesses willing to testify. Physical evidence that can't be explained away by claiming his associates acted without his knowledge." "I'm working on it," Evelyn had said through gritted teeth. "Work faster," Davidson had advised. "Or work on something else. Because the pressure I'm getting from City Hall to shut this down is becoming impossible to ignore, and I can only protect you for so long before protecting you costs me my own career." So now Evelyn sat in her corner booth with her third coffee and growing sense that the walls were closing in from multiple directions. She needed breakthrough. Needed evidence so clear and undeniable that even political pressure couldn't make it disappear. Needed something that would force the city to acknowledge what everyone already knew but no one could prove, that Leonardo Rossi was criminal who'd built empire on violence and corruption. She was so absorbed in reviewing financial documents for the 100th time that she didn't notice when someone slid into the booth across from her until his voice cut through her concentration with the kind of smooth confidence that immediately triggered her threat assessment instincts. "You look like you're trying to solve the world's problems through spreadsheet analysis," the man said, his tone conveying amusement without mockery. "Though in my experience, the world's problems rarely fit into neat columns and rows." Evelyn looked up sharply, her hand automatically moving to close her laptop before civilian could see confidential case information. What she found was man who looked vaguely familiar in ways she couldn't immediately place. Handsome in that refined manner that suggested expensive grooming and genetic luck, dressed casually but expensively in clothing that screamed money without being ostentatious about it. Dark eyes that held intelligence and something else she couldn't quite identify. Slight smile that suggested he was genuinely amused rather than deliberately invasive. "This booth is occupied," Evelyn said coolly, her professional mask firmly in place. "If you need seating, there are several empty tables." "I don't need seating," the man interrupted gently, his smile widening slightly. "I need conversation with someone who looks like they think too much about things that matter. And you, Dr. Reed, definitely fit that description." The use of her name made Evelyn's pulse spike with alarm. "How do you know who I am?" she demanded, her hand moving toward the service weapon concealed under her jacket. Relax, he said, raising both hands in gesture of harmlessness that somehow didn't feel harmless at all. Your name is on your coffee cup. Very observant of me, I know. Though I'll admit I might have overheard the barista call you Der Reed when you ordered. I'm not stalking you, I'm just practiced at paying attention to my surroundings. Evelyn glanced at her coffee cup and saw that yes, her name was indeed written on the side in the barista's distinctive handwriting. The explanation was logical, reasonable, exactly the kind of thing that would account for stranger knowing her name. So why did her instincts continue screaming that this man was significantly more dangerous than his pleasant demeanor suggested? What do you want? She asked, keeping her voice neutral despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Conversation, he replied simply, settling more comfortably into the booth like he planned to stay regardless of her protests. I'm curious about what kind of problems require such intense focus on a Saturday morning. Work? Personal crisis? Existential questioning of whether your chosen profession actually matters in grand scheme of things. None of your business, Evelyn said flatly. Fair enough, the man agreed easily. Then let me ask a different question. Do you ever stop working? Ever allow yourself to exist as something other than brilliant investigator solving puzzles that most people wouldn't even recognize as puzzles? The question was too specific, too knowing, and Evelyn felt her suspicion crystallizing into certainty that this was not random encounter. Who are you? She demanded. Really? Because you're not random stranger making small talk over coffee. Luca, he said, offering his hand across the table. And you're right, I'm not particularly random. I noticed you here last week. Noticed you were alone, focused, completely absorbed in whatever you're working on. Thought maybe you could use interruption from someone who appreciates intensity of purpose. Evelyn didn't take his hand. I don't need interruptions. I need to work. Everyone needs interruptions, Luca countered, withdrawing his hand without apparent offense. Otherwise we become so focused on whatever we're pursuing that we forget why we're pursuing it in the first place. What's the point of solving problems if you never stop to appreciate moments when problems aren't actively demanding your attention? Despite herself, despite every professional instinct screaming at her to end this conversation and leave immediately, Evelyn found herself intrigued by the man across from her. There was something compelling about his confidence, something magnetic about the way he spoke like he had all the time in the world and was choosing to spend it trying to convince her to take break from work that was consuming her life. Philosophy from a stranger in a coffee shop, she said, allowing faint amusement to color her voice. That's either very presumptuous or very bold. Can't it be both? Luca asked, his smile suggesting he knew exactly how presumptuous he was being and didn't particularly care. Though I'd argue it's neither. It's just observation from someone who recognizes fellow obsessive when he sees one. You're not just working, Dr. Reed. You're hunting something. Chasing some truth that you believe matters more than sleep or nutrition or basic human connection. I recognize that intensity because I felt it myself. And what were you hunting? Evelyn asked before she could stop herself. Answers, Luca said simply. About who I wanted to be versus who circumstances were trying to make me. About whether playing the role everyone expected was easier than fighting to define myself differently. About whether comfort was worth the cost of compromising principles that mattered. The admission was unexpectedly genuine, delivered without the performance or manipulation that Evelyn had learned to expect from people who approached her with ulterior motives. For a moment, she allowed herself to see him as simply person rather than potential threat. Someone who was genuinely curious about her, genuinely interested in conversation that went beyond surface pleasantries. And did you find your answers? She asked. Some of them, Luca replied. Others I'm still searching for. Which I suspect puts me in similar position as you, brilliant investigator who's discovered that some questions don't have neat solutions that fit into evidence logs and case files. They talked for over an hour, conversation flowing with unexpected ease despite Evelyn's initial resistance. Luca was intelligent, well-read, capable of discussing everything from forensic methodology to philosophy to the specific challenges of maintaining personal identity while working in fields that demanded complete professional dedication. He never pressed when she deflected personal questions, never pushed when she redirected conversation away from specifics of her current investigation, never made her feel like she was being interrogated despite his obvious curiosity about who she was beneath the professional mask. It was the most normal human interaction Evelyn had experienced in months, possibly years. And despite every instinct telling her that this was dangerous, that letting stranger into even peripheral aspects of her life was vulnerability she couldn't afford, she found herself reluctant to end the conversation. I should get back to work, she finally said as her phone buzzed with reminder about laboratory analysis she'd scheduled for that afternoon. Of course, Luca said, standing with the same fluid grace he'd displayed sitting. Though I hope you'll allow me to interrupt your work again sometime. It's rare to meet someone who thinks as intensely as you do about things that actually matter. How do you know what matters to me? Evelyn challenged. Because I can see it in your eyes, Luca replied, his gaze holding hers with intensity that made her breath catch. Whatever you're pursuing, it's not just job or career ambition. It's calling. Purpose. The thing that gives your life meaning even when it costs you everything else. And people with that kind of dedication are either going to change the world or destroy themselves trying. I'm curious which category you'll fall into. Then he was gone, disappeared into the Saturday crowd with the same smooth efficiency as the man who'd visited her at police headquarters weeks ago, and Evelyn was left staring after him with her pulse racing and her mind spinning through possibilities she didn't want to examine too closely. That encounter had been 3 days ago. Now Evelyn was in her laboratory running comparison analysis on DNA samples from 5 different crime scenes, trying to establish pattern that would prove organizational connection, when her secure phone rang with numbers she didn't recognize. Dr. Reed, she answered cautiously. You need to see something. The voice was male, young, frightened in a way that suggested genuine fear rather than performance. I have information about your Rossi investigation. About who he really is and what he's really done. But I can't bring it to the police station. He has people there. People who report to him. I need to meet you somewhere private. Every professional instinct Evelyn had developed over 15 years screamed that this was trap. Unknown caller claiming to have information, insisting on private meeting, suggesting that law enforcement facility wasn't safe. These were classic elements of ambush scenario designed to isolate targets before eliminating them. If you have information about criminal activity, you can submit it through official channels, Evelyn said carefully. Anonymous tips line, online reporting portal, written statement left with. He'll know, the voice interrupted desperately. He always knows. The only reason I'm still alive is because I've been careful, but if I use official channels he'll know it was me and then I'm dead. Please, Dr. Reed. I know you're close to proving what he is. I can give you the final piece. The evidence that ties Leonardo Rossi directly to murders you can't explain away as organizational activity without his knowledge. The mention of Leonardo Rossi's full name made Evelyn's breath catch. What kind of evidence? She demanded. Photographs, the voice said. Video footage. Recordings of conversations where he personally ordered hits. Everything you need to prove he's not just crime boss who delegates dirty work. He's hands-on killer who's murdered people himself. But you have to meet me. Tonight. Alone. Or the evidence disappears and I disappear and you'll never get this close again. It was absolutely trap. Evelyn knew it with certainty that came from years of experience with how criminal organizations operated. But it was also potentially legitimate break-in case that had stalled frustratingly. And if there was even small chance that this caller genuinely had evidence that could directly tie Rossi to murders? Where? She asked against every ounce of better judgment. Abandoned textile factory on Riverside. Building 7. Midnight. Come alone and unarmed or I bolt. The line went dead before Evelyn could respond, and she was left staring at her phone with her heart hammering and her tactical mind already calculating how to approach obvious trap in a way that minimized risk while maximizing chance of obtaining evidence if legitimate. She should report this to Davidson. Should request backup. Should absolutely not go alone to abandoned factory at midnight based on anonymous tip that screamed ambush scenario. But if she involved official channels, if the caller was right about Rossi having informants within the department, then whoever had this evidence would disappear and she'd lose potentially irreplaceable opportunity to obtain proof that could finally bring Leonardo Rossi down. Evelyn made her decision with the kind of cold calculation that had kept her alive through 15 years of dangerous investigations. She would go. Would take precautions. Body armor under civilian clothing, backup weapon, GPS tracker that would alert trusted colleague if she didn't check in within specified time frame. Would approach tactically, scout the location before entering, maintain exit awareness and defensive positioning throughout. She was forensic investigator, but she'd also completed same tactical training as field agents. Could handle herself in dangerous situations. Had survived encounters with violent criminals before through combination of preparation and situational awareness. This would be no different. She'd obtain the evidence if legitimate, or she'd extract herself if threatening, and either way she'd be one step closer to ending Leonardo Rossi's reign as untouchable criminal king. What Evelyn didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that the abandoned textile factory wasn't trap set by Rossi organization to eliminate her. It was trap set by rival syndicate that wanted both her investigation files and leverage against Rossi himself. And Leonardo Rossi, who'd been monitoring her activities with obsessive attention, knew exactly what was about to happen. The question was whether he'd intervene to save her, or whether he'd let the hunter finally become prey and solve his investigator problem through conveniently timed tragedy that wouldn't trace back to him. Leo stood in his operations center watching real-time surveillance feeds of the abandoned textile factory on multiple screens, his expression carefully neutral despite the fury building in his chest. Someone had dared to target his investigator. Had set trap using her investigation as bait. Had apparently decided that eliminating Dr. Evelyn Reed while framing him for her death would serve dual purpose of removing threat and destabilizing his organization. Markov Syndicate, Matteo reported from his position monitoring communications. Confirmed through intercepted chatter. They're planning to grab her, extract her case files, then stage execution that looks like you ordered hit on investigator who got too close. Public relations nightmare combined with law enforcement pressure that would normally take months to arrange. How many operatives? Leo asked, his voice dangerously calm. 12 confirmed. Possibly more in reserve. They're not taking chances, they know her reputation, know she's trained. They're planning overwhelming force followed by immediate extraction. Leo should have let it happen. Should have allowed the Markov Syndicate to eliminate his investigator problem while simultaneously creating situation he could exploit for his own advantage. Dr. Evelyn Reed was dangerous, getting closer to evidence that could actually threaten him, absolutely committed to bringing him down regardless of cost. Letting her die would be strategically sound decision. Would remove immediate threat while positioning him to retaliate against Markov organization for attacking on his territory. Would solve multiple problems with single convenient tragedy. But Leo found himself unable to give that order. Found himself watching surveillance footage of Dr. Reed approaching the factory with tactical caution, her movements suggesting military training despite primarily being scientist. Found himself fascinated by her courage, or possibly her recklessness, in walking knowingly into dangerous situation because her commitment to justice outweighed her sense of self-preservation. Mobilize team, he ordered, his decision made despite strategic illogic. Full tactical response. I want her extracted before Markov can execute their grab. And I want every operative involved in this ambush eliminated permanently. They attacked my territory, targeted someone under my observation, and apparently thought I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. They're going to learn exactly how wrong they were. Boss, Matteo said carefully, saving her doesn't solve the problem of her investigating you. Arguably makes it worse by proving you're monitoring her activities closely enough to know when she's in danger. I'm aware, Leo replied coldly. But Dr. Reed is mine to deal with, not theirs. If she's going to be eliminated, it will be my decision, my timing, my methods. Not some second-rate organization using her as pawn in territorial dispute. The truth, which Leo wasn't quite ready to articulate even to himself, was more complicated than strategic calculation. He'd spent weeks watching Dr. Evelyn Reed work with focused intensity. Had studied her patterns, learned her habits, come to recognize the way she approached problems with combination of scientific methodology and intuitive leaps that made her genuinely brilliant investigator. Had found himself increasingly fascinated by women who looked at blood spatter and saw truth, who examined chemical residue and reconstructed crimes that criminals thought they'd hidden perfectly. She was hunting him with single-minded determination that most people reserved for personal vendettas. And instead of finding it threatening, Leo found it compelling, challenging. Almost exciting to have an opponent who couldn't be easily intimidated or corrupted or eliminated through standard methods. He didn't want her dead. Didn't want her investigation to end through violence that would make her martyr and potentially trigger exactly the kind of law enforcement attention he'd spent years avoiding. Didn't want to lose the one person in his life who saw him clearly as dangerous criminal rather than respected businessman who happened to have unfortunate family connections. What he wanted, and this was admission that disturbed him more than tactical considerations, was to see how close she could get. How much evidence she could collect. Whether her brilliance was sufficient to actually threaten him, or whether she'd ultimately hit wall where forensic science couldn't penetrate the careful structures he'd built to protect himself. And he definitely couldn't answer those questions if the Markov Syndicate killed her in an abandoned factory. So Leo watched his tactical team deploy with military precision, approaching the textile factory from multiple vectors while Dr. Reed entered through the main entrance with her weapon drawn and her body language suggesting she recognized the trap but was proceeding anyway out of desperate need for evidence. She was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Possibly both. Either way, she was about to learn that she had protectors she didn't know about and absolutely wouldn't want if she did. The ambush happened exactly as Leo's intelligence had predicted. Dr. Reed entered the main factory floor, sweeping the space with tactical precision, calling out for her supposed informant. The Markov operatives moved from concealment with coordinated efficiency, surrounding her with overwhelming force before she could retreat to defensive position. Leo watched her fight. Impressive combat skills for someone whose primary training was forensic science rather than field operations. She took down 2 operatives before they managed to disarm her, maintained defensive positioning even when outnumbered, and only stopped resisting when someone pressed gun directly against her head with clear intent to execute if she continued fighting. "Brave," Leo murmured, watching her expression shift from tactical assessment to cold fury at being captured. "Foolish but brave." His team breached from 3 directions simultaneously, and what followed was controlled violence that was over in less than 90 seconds. The Markov operatives never stood chance against operators who'd been trained by same military instructors who worked with Special Forces units. By the time Leo entered the factory floor personally, against Mateo's strong protests about unnecessary risk, the situation had been completely secured with multiple Markov casualties and 0 losses on his side. Dr. Evelyn Reed was sitting on the floor where she'd been forced down during the ambush, her hands zip-tied behind her back, her expression showing combination of shock and confusion and growing anger as she processed what had just happened. She looked up when Leo approached, and he watched recognition flash across her face, not of who he was specifically, but recognition that she'd seen him before somewhere that her mind couldn't immediately place. "You," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear that she was clearly fighting to suppress. "The coffee shop. You're—" She stopped, her brilliant mind clearly processing at accelerated pace. "This was trap. You knew. Oh God, you're working with them. This was elaborate setup too." "To save your life," Leo interrupted, crouching down to her eye level with movement that was deliberately non-threatening despite circumstances. "Though I can see how you might interpret it differently given that you're currently restrained and surrounded by armed operatives who just killed multiple people." "Who are you?" Evelyn demanded, her eyes scanning his face with the same systematic attention she probably used examining crime scenes. "Really? Because you're not random stranger from coffee shop any more than tonight was legitimate meeting." Leo smiled slightly, impressed by how quickly she'd assembled accurate assessment despite traumatic circumstances. "Leonardo Rossi," he said simply, watching her expression shift from confusion to absolute shock. "Though you probably know me better as the man you've been trying to destroy for the past 2 months with your forensic investigation." The silence that followed was electric with implications. Evelyn stared at him with mixture of horror and fury and something else that might have been grudging respect for the sheer audacity of his deception. "You approached me," she finally said, her voice barely above whisper. "In the coffee shop. You sat across from me and made conversation while knowing exactly who I was and what I was trying to do." "I was curious," Leo admitted. "Wanted to see up close what kind of person was foolish enough to pursue me with such determination. Wanted to understand whether you were motivated by career ambition or something deeper. Wanted—" He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Wanted to meet the woman who looked at evidence of my crimes and saw truth rather than convenient fiction that let her sleep at night." "You're a murderer," Evelyn said flatly. "A criminal who's built empire on violence and corruption. And you think I should be flattered that you found me interesting enough to stalk?" "I'm not stalking you, Dr. Reed," Leo corrected with amusement he couldn't quite suppress. "I'm protecting you. There's difference. If I wanted you dead, you'd have died in this factory tonight. Instead, I'm the reason you're still breathing despite walking into obvious trap that should have gotten you killed." "Why?" Evelyn demanded. "Why protect me? Why not just let them kill me and solve your investigator problem?" "Because," Leo said, reaching out to cut her zip ties with knife that appeared in his hand with practiced ease, "you're mine to deal with, not theirs. And because—" He stopped, meeting her eyes with intensity that made her breath catch despite her fear and anger. "Because I haven't decided yet whether I want to destroy you or simply watch you try to destroy me. The chase has become significantly more interesting than I expected." He stood and offered his hand to help her up. Evelyn stared at it like it was venomous snake, clearly torn between accepting help from man she'd been trying to imprison and maintaining her dignity by refusing assistance from criminal who just killed people in front of her. Finally, she took his hand, and Leo felt jolt of electricity at the contact. Inappropriate attraction to woman who was actively trying to end his freedom and possibly his life. He pulled her to her feet with perhaps more force than necessary, bringing her close enough that he could smell her shampoo and see the rapid pulse at her throat. "I should arrest you right now," Evelyn said, though her voice lacked conviction given that she was surrounded by his operatives and had just been saved from immediate execution. "You could try," Leo agreed. "Though I'd recommend against it given current circumstances. You're in my territory, surrounded by my people, and the only reason you're alive is because I chose to intervene. Attempting arrest seems like poor strategic choice given your situation." "So what happens now?" Evelyn asked. "You've revealed yourself, saved my life, and apparently expect me to what? Stop investigating you out of gratitude?" "I expect nothing," Leo replied. "Except perhaps that you'll be more careful about accepting anonymous tips that require you to meet alone in abandoned buildings at midnight. And that you'll acknowledge, if only to yourself, that the man you've been hunting is significantly more complex than simple criminal you want me to be." "There's nothing complex about murder," Evelyn said coldly. "No," Leo agreed. "But there's significant complexity in surviving world where violence is primary language and building empire while maintaining enough legitimate business that you can move through society without constant law enforcement attention. You see me as villain, Dr. Reed. And perhaps you're right. But villains are rarely simple, and the evidence you're collecting tells only fraction of the story." "Then tell me the rest," Evelyn challenged. "Explain yourself. Make me understand why someone with your intelligence and resources chooses crime instead of legitimate success." "Because crime is honest," Leo said simply. "Legitimate business pretends to be ethical while exploiting workers and evading taxes and destroying competitors through methods that are technically legal but morally identical to what I do more directly. At least in my world, everyone knows the rules. Power matters. Loyalty matters. And if you cross someone, you pay consequences immediately rather than through years of litigation and corporate maneuvering." "That's justification, not explanation," Evelyn said. "Perhaps," Leo acknowledged. "But it's honest justification, which is more than most legitimate businessmen would give you." He stepped back, creating distance that felt both strategic and reluctant. "You should go home, Dr. Reed. Process what happened tonight. Decide whether you're going to continue your investigation despite learning that I'm monitoring your activities closely enough to know when you're in danger. And consider that perhaps the man you're hunting isn't quite the monster your evidence suggests." "You just killed people," Evelyn pointed out. "In front of me. With efficiency that suggests extensive practice. I killed people who were planning to torture you for information before executing you in ways that would permanently end your investigation," Leo corrected. "If that makes me monster, then I'll accept the designation. But I'd argue it makes me someone who doesn't tolerate threats against people I'm invested in protecting." "Why are you invested in protecting me?" Evelyn demanded. "That's not a rhetorical question. I genuinely don't understand why criminal would save life of investigator actively trying to imprison him." Leo smiled then, dangerous and genuinely amused. "Because, Dr. Reed, you're the most interesting thing that's happened to me in years. And I'm curious to see whether your brilliance is sufficient to actually catch me, or whether you'll ultimately realize that some people are too careful to be caught through conventional methods. Consider tonight's rescue as professional courtesy between worthy opponents. Next time you walk into trap, you might not be so fortunate." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, the evidence you're looking for, the proof that ties me directly to criminal activity rather than just organizational involvement? It exists. But finding it will require you to go places your forensic training hasn't prepared you for. Places where the line between hunter and prey becomes significantly less clear. Are you prepared for that, Dr. Reed?" Before Evelyn could answer, before she could articulate response to implications of his question, Leo had disappeared into the shadows with his team, leaving her alone in factory full of bodies and her own racing thoughts about what had just happened and what it meant for her investigation going forward. She should call Davidson. Should report the ambush and the rescue and the revelation that Leonardo Rossi had been watching her closely enough to intervene when she was threatened. Should use this encounter as evidence of his criminal activity and his admission that he was monitoring law enforcement investigator. But as Evelyn stood in that abandoned factory with the scent of gunpowder and blood heavy in the air, she found herself unable to immediately call for backup. Found herself processing the way Rossi had looked at her, with fascination and challenge and something that looked disturbingly like admiration. Found herself acknowledging that the man she'd been hunting was significantly more intelligent, more dangerous, and more compelling than the simple villain she'd wanted him to be. He'd saved her life. Had killed people to protect her from threats she'd walked into through combination of desperation and poor judgment. had admitted he was watching her investigation with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was more than simple problem to be eliminated. What did it mean when the monster you were hunting treated you with more consideration than your own department showed? When the criminal you wanted to imprison protected you more effectively than your badge and weapon had? Evelyn didn't have answers. But as she finally pulled out her phone to call for backup and crime scene team to process the multiple bodies, she knew with bone-deep certainty that her investigation had just become infinitely more complicated. She wasn't just hunting Leonardo Rossi anymore. She was engaged in some kind of dangerous game with an opponent who was treating her as worthy adversary rather than simple threat. And despite every professional instinct telling her this was manipulation designed to compromise her investigation, despite knowing that every moment she spent thinking about him as complex person rather than simple criminal made her less effective as investigator, despite all of that, Evelyn couldn't deny that she was more fascinated by Leonardo Rossi after their encounter than she'd been when he was simply abstract criminal she was trying to catch through forensic evidence. The hunter had met the prey. And neither of them was quite what the other had expected. The file arrived at Evelyn's apartment 3 days after the textile factory incident, delivered by courier service that had no record of who'd paid for the delivery or where the package had originated. It was simple manila envelope, unmarked except for her name printed in neat block letters, and the moment Evelyn opened it she knew exactly who had sent it and why. Photographs spilled across her kitchen table, high-resolution images that showed Leonardo Rossi in situations that demolished any remaining illusion that he was simply businessman with unfortunate family connections. Here was Leo standing over body in what looked like execution scene, his expression cold and calculating in ways that made Evelyn's breath catch. Here was Leo meeting with known crime bosses in locations that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Here was Leo personally overseeing operations that were clearly criminal, drug distribution, weapons trafficking, extortion that looked remarkably organized and systematic. But mixed with the damning photographs were images that complicated the simple narrative Evelyn had built about who Leonardo Rossi was. Photos of him at Children's Hospital, sitting with sick kids who looked at him like hero rather than criminal. Images of him protecting younger family members from violence that appeared to be threatening them. Documents showing donations to social programs that provided real help to communities struggling with poverty that his own organization arguably helped perpetuate. And underneath all the photographs was single-typed note. You wanted evidence that shows who I really am. Here it is, all of it. The crimes and the contradictions. The violence and the occasional humanity. Study it carefully, Dr. Reed, and then decide whether your black and white view of justice can accommodate someone who exists entirely in the gray spaces between villain and hero. Evelyn spread the evidence across her table and stared at it with her heart hammering and her tactical mind spinning through implications. This was it. This was the proof she'd been desperately seeking. Direct evidence of Leonardo Rossi's personal involvement in criminal activity that couldn't be explained away as organizational operations without his knowledge. These photographs and documents would support warrant, would justify arrest, would provide foundation for case that could finally bring him down. So why had he sent them to her? Why provide evidence of his own crimes to an investigator who'd been trying unsuccessfully to collect exactly this kind of proof? The answer, when it crystallized in her mind, was both disturbing and oddly compelling, because he wanted her to see him completely. Wanted her to understand that he wasn't simple monster or uncomplicated villain. Wanted her to be forced to acknowledge the complexity of someone who could commit atrocities and perform genuine kindnesses, who could order executions and save children's lives, who existed in moral spaces that her rigid sense of justice didn't have neat categories for. He was challenging her, testing her, possibly even seducing her in ways that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with forcing her to question the fundamental beliefs that had guided her entire career. Evelyn was still processing the implications when her phone rang with numbers she now recognized as belonging to untraceable burner that Leo apparently used for communications he didn't want officially recorded. "Did you receive my gift?" His voice was smooth, amused, absolutely confident despite having just provided evidence that could destroy him. "You're insane," Evelyn said flatly. "Sending me photographs of yourself committing crimes. Providing documentary evidence of criminal activity. What possible strategic logic justifies?" "I'm providing context," Leo interrupted. "You've spent months building case based on evidence that shows only crimes without understanding motivations or circumstances or the complicated reality of existing in a world where violence is sometimes only language that matters. I wanted you to see complete picture before you make final decisions about whether destroying me is really what your justice requires. Those photographs show you murdering people," Evelyn said, her voice tight with controlled anger. That's not context, that's confession. Those photographs show me executing people who'd committed crimes against my organization, Leo corrected calmly. People who'd betrayed trust, endangered families, or directly threatened lives of people under my protection. Does that make it legal? No. Does it make it morally uncomplicated? Absolutely not. But it makes it significantly different from simple murder for profit or pleasure. The law doesn't recognize those distinctions, Evelyn said. No, Leo agreed. But you do. I've studied you, Dr. Reed. Learned how you think, how you approach problems, how you distinguish between crimes that matter and crimes that are technically violations but ultimately victimless. You're not rigid adherent to law as written, you're a pursuer of justice as it should be. Which means you understand that context matters even when law says it doesn't. You don't know me, Evelyn protested, though her voice lacked conviction. I know you better than you think, Leo replied. I know you chose forensic science because you wanted objective truth in a world full of subjective lies. I know you work alone because relationships feel like distractions from purpose that matters more than personal connection. I know you barely sleep, barely eat, barely exist as anything other than investigator because solving crimes is the only thing that makes you feel like your life has meaning. Am I wrong? Evelyn's silence was answer enough, and she heard Leo's quiet satisfaction through the phone line. I'm not trying to corrupt you, he continued, his voice softening slightly. I'm trying to make you see that the world isn't as simple as your evidence suggests. That people, even criminals, are more complicated than labels we apply to them. That maybe, just maybe, the man you've been hunting deserves consideration beyond guilty or not guilty binary that your profession requires. Why? Evelyn finally asked, her voice barely above whisper. Why do you care what I think? Why does my opinion matter to someone who's built empire on not caring about anyone's judgment? Because, Leo said, and for first time since she'd met him, his voice held something that sounded like genuine emotion rather than calculated strategy. You're the only person in my life who sees me clearly as criminal and still chooses to engage with me as complex person rather than simple threat. You're brilliant, dedicated, incorruptible in ways that I find both frustrating and absolutely fascinating. And he paused, seeming to struggle with articulation. I haven't wanted anyone's good opinion in years. Haven't cared what people thought beyond whether they feared me enough to stay loyal. But I care what you think, Dr. Reed. Care enough that I'm apparently willing to provide evidence of my crimes just to make you understand that I'm more than the monster your investigation has tried to reduce me to. The admission hung between them, weighted with implications that Evelyn wasn't ready to examine. I should use this evidence to arrest you, she said. Should take these photographs directly to the district attorney and demand warrant for your arrest. You should, Leo agreed. If you still believe that's what justice requires. But before you do, meet with me one more time. Let me show you something that your evidence can't capture. Let me demonstrate why the communities I control are sometimes better off with my organization running things than they would be under legitimate government that's proven repeatedly it doesn't care about poor neighborhoods or immigrant populations or people who exist in spaces where legal protection is theoretical rather than real. That's not how justice works, Evelyn said. No, Leo acknowledged. But maybe it should be. Maybe justice that's too rigid to recognize context isn't really justice at all. It's just enforcement of laws that were written by people who'll never experience circumstances that make breaking those laws feel like survival rather than crime. You're trying to manipulate me, Evelyn accused. I'm trying to complicate you, Leo corrected. Trying to force you to acknowledge that the world you want to exist in, where evidence points clearly at guilt or innocence and justice is simply a matter of applying law correctly, isn't the world we actually inhabit. We live in messy reality where good people sometimes do bad things and bad people occasionally do good things, and reducing everyone to simple categories makes us feel safer but ultimately makes us less effective at actually improving anything. One meeting, Evelyn heard herself say despite every professional instinct screaming that this was a mistake. One chance to show me whatever you think will change my mind. But then I'm taking this evidence to my superiors and pushing for your arrest regardless of what you show me. Fair enough, Leo said, and she could hear his satisfaction at having achieved whatever goal he'd been pursuing. Tonight. I'll send car for you at 8. Come alone, come unarmed if you're comfortable doing so, and prepare to see reality that your laboratory hasn't prepared you for. The line went dead before Evelyn could respond, and she was left staring at photographs spread across her table while her mind spun through tactical considerations and emotional complications she absolutely could not afford to entertain. She was going to meet with Leonardo Rossi. Again. Deliberately. Despite knowing he was a dangerous criminal who'd killed people and built empire on violence and corruption. Despite having evidence that could finally bring him down if she used it correctly. She was going to let him try to convince her that he was more than simple villain. Was going to listen to his justifications and rationalizations and attempts to make her see his crimes as something other than straightforward criminality. And the worst part, the truly terrifying part that Evelyn could barely acknowledge even to herself, was that she was curious about what he wanted to show her. Was intellectually fascinated by a man who could commit atrocities and save her life with equal conviction. Was emotionally compromised in ways that made her question whether she was still capable of objective investigation or whether Leo had already succeeded in corrupting her judgment through attention and protection and the kind of focused interest that made her feel seen in ways she hadn't experienced in years. Chief Davidson would say she was compromised. Would pull her from the investigation immediately if he knew she was meeting privately with primary suspect. Would be absolutely right that this was textbook example of investigator losing objectivity through combination of Stockholm Syndrome and inappropriate attraction to dangerous criminal. But Evelyn wasn't going to tell Davidson. Wasn't going to report the photographs or the meeting or the complicated tangle of professional duty and personal curiosity that was currently overwhelming her better judgment. She was going to go. Was going to see what Leo wanted to show her. Was going to make final decision about whether justice required his destruction or whether maybe, just maybe, the world was more complicated than her forensic evidence suggested. The car arrived exactly at 8, luxury sedan with driver who maintained professional silence during 40-minute drive that took them to neighborhood Evelyn recognized as one of the poorest in the city. Immigrant community that had been effectively abandoned by city services, left to deteriorate while developers focused on gentrification projects in more profitable areas. High crime rates, failing schools, inadequate medical care, all the markers of systemic neglect that made people's lives shorter and harder and more desperate than anyone in comfortable neighborhoods would ever understand. The car stopped outside community center that looked surprisingly well maintained compared to surrounding buildings. Clean exterior, lights that actually worked, security presence that was visible but not threatening. And standing at entrance, waiting with that same magnetic confidence she'd come to recognize, was Leonardo Rossi. He'd abandoned the expensive suits for more casual clothing that let him blend with neighborhood residents, though anyone with tactical eye would immediately recognize him as dangerous despite the relaxed appearance. He opened her door personally, offering his hand with courtesy that felt genuine despite their complicated circumstances. "Thank you for coming," Leo said as Evelyn reluctantly took his hand and let him help her from the vehicle. "I know this required trust you have no logical reason to extend to me." "I came for information," Evelyn corrected, pulling her hand from his as soon as she was standing. "Not because I trust you." "Fair distinction," Leo acknowledged with slight smile. "Come on. There's someone I want you to meet." The community center was bustling with activity despite the late hour. Children doing homework with volunteer tutors, teenagers participating in what looked like job training program, adults attending English language classes or legal aid workshops. Everything was organized with the kind of systematic efficiency that suggested professional management and adequate funding, which was remarkable given the neighborhood's economic reality. "This is yours," Evelyn said, recognizing the pattern. "This center. The programs. You're funding all of this." "My organization is," Leo corrected. "We provide resources that legitimate government refuses to allocate to communities that don't vote in numbers that matter politically. We ensure people have access to education, job training, legal assistance, medical care, all the services that should be provided by city but aren't because poor immigrant neighborhoods don't generate tax revenue that justifies investment. Funded by criminal activity," Evelyn pointed out. "Funded by profits from operations that the same government claims to oppose but actually tolerates because prosecuting them effectively would require addressing systemic issues they'd prefer to ignore," Leo countered. "Yes. My money comes from drug distribution and protection rackets and other crimes that your investigation has documented extensively. But the question isn't where the money comes from, it's what the money accomplishes and whether communities are better or worse off because my organization operates here." He led her through the facility, introducing her to staff who clearly respected him, showing her programs that were genuinely helping people improve their circumstances, explaining with uncomfortable clarity how his organization provided stability and opportunity that legitimate institutions had failed to deliver. "The dealers who work for me are required to stay away from schools," Leo said as they observed a group of teenagers practicing interview skills. "Required to ensure their operations don't expose children to violence or exploitation. Required to contribute portion of their earnings to community programs like this one." Does that make drug dealing acceptable? No. But it makes it significantly less destructive than it would be under organizations that don't care about community impact beyond profit extraction. You're still poisoning people, Evelyn said. Still providing substances that destroy lives and families. I'm meeting demand that exists regardless of whether I supply it, Leo corrected. Demand that legitimate society has proven unable or unwilling to address through treatment programs or economic opportunities that would make drug use less appealing alternative to hopelessness. Should I not supply that demand? Fine, then someone else will. Someone who won't require community investment, won't prohibit sales near schools, won't care if children get caught in crossfire of territorial disputes. Is that better? Is that what your justice requires? Evelyn didn't have answer. Couldn't articulate response that acknowledged the fundamental problem he was describing while maintaining her position that his criminality was inexcusable. So she let him continue showing her programs and introducing her to people whose lives had apparently been improved by organization that she'd been trying to destroy for months. The final introduction was to young woman maybe 20 years old, working on GED preparation with focused intensity that Evelyn immediately recognized as similar to her own approach to problems. Leo waited until the woman finished her current section before approaching, and the way her face lit up when she saw him suggested genuine affection rather than fear-based respect. Dr. Reed, this is Maria, Leo said. Maria, this is the investigator I told you about. The one trying to put me in prison. Maria assessed Evelyn with sharp intelligence before offering her hand. He says you're brilliant. Says you see evidence that most people miss and you don't let powerful people intimidate you into giving up. He talks about me? Evelyn asked, unsure whether to be flattered or disturbed. Constantly, Maria confirmed with slight smile. Usually while complaining that you're making his life difficult by being too good at your job. But also with respect. He admires you even though you're trying to destroy him. I'm trying to ensure he faces consequences for his crimes, Evelyn corrected. My uncle sold drugs for different organization, Maria said, her expression sobering. Got killed in territorial dispute when I was 16. Left me alone with no family, no money, nowhere to go. I was about to end up trafficked when Mr. Rossi's people found me. Brought me here. Gave me safe place to live, opportunity to finish school, job training so I could build legitimate career. He saved my life when no one else cared whether I lived or died. That doesn't excuse his criminal activity, Evelyn said, though her voice lacked conviction. No, Maria agreed. But it complicates it. Makes it harder to reduce him to simple villain when you've met people whose lives he's saved. When you've seen communities that function better under his organization than they did under previous criminals or under legitimate government that treated them like they didn't exist. It was exactly the argument Leo had been making, delivered by someone with no obvious reason to lie on his behalf. And as Evelyn looked around the community center, at children getting homework help, at adults improving their language skills, at teenagers preparing for legitimate careers, she couldn't deny that the impact was real even if the funding source was criminal. This is manipulation, Evelyn said to Leo as they left the center and walked toward his waiting car. Showing me sympathetic people and community programs designed to make me question whether arresting you serves justice or simply satisfies my need for moral certainty. It's context, Leo replied. Complicated, uncomfortable context that your forensic evidence can't capture because blood spatter and DNA don't tell stories about what happens to communities when criminal organizations are eliminated without addressing the systematic failures that made those organizations necessary in first place. Criminal organizations are never necessary, Evelyn protested. Tell that to Maria, Leo said quietly. Tell that to all the families in this neighborhood who've been abandoned by every legitimate institution that should be helping them. Tell them that they should wait patiently for government to suddenly start caring about poor immigrant populations instead of accepting help from organizations that actually provide services they desperately need. They reached the car but neither moved to enter it. Instead they stood in the darkness between streetlights, the night air heavy with tension that had nothing to do with their argument and everything to do with the magnetic pull that neither seemed able to resist despite how absolutely inappropriate it was. You're asking me to choose between justice and practical compassion, Evelyn finally said. Between enforcing law as written and acknowledging that reality is more complicated than legal code suggests. That's impossible choice. No, Leo disagreed, stepping closer with the kind of controlled intensity that made her breath catch. I'm asking you to be honest about what you really want. About whether your pursuit of me is really about justice or whether it's about something else entirely. About whether catching me would actually make world better or whether it would just satisfy your need to believe that problems can be solved through careful evidence collection and proper application of law. What else would it be about? Evelyn demanded, though she knew exactly what he was implying. This, Leo said simply, closing the remaining distance between them and kissing her with intensity that demolished any remaining pretense that their relationship was purely adversarial. Evelyn should have pushed him away. Should have maintained professional boundaries. Should have absolutely not responded by kissing him back with equal hunger, her hands fisting in his shirt while his arms wrapped around her waist and pulled her flush against him. But 3 months of tension and denied attraction and complicated fascination finally found expression, and Evelyn lost herself in the taste of him, the feel of his mouth moving against hers with practiced skill, the way he held her like she was simultaneously precious and potentially dangerous. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Leo rested his forehead against hers with expression that combined triumph and something that looked disturbingly like genuine emotion. "Tell me you don't feel this," he said, his voice rough. "Tell me the chemistry between us is just my imagination and I'll let you go back to your investigation without further interference." "I can't," Evelyn admitted, the honesty costing her more than any previous concession. "Can't tell you that I don't feel it. Can't pretend that I haven't been thinking about you constantly since the textile factory. Can't claim that my pursuit of you is purely professional when clearly it's become something significantly more complicated." "Then stop fighting it," Leo urged, his thumb tracing her jaw with gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about his capacity for violence. "Stop trying to reduce us to simple categories of hunter and prey, investigator and criminal, good and evil. Acknowledge that we're both more complicated than those labels and that maybe, just maybe, we're exactly what the other has been looking for without knowing we were searching." "You're a criminal," Evelyn said, though the words felt hollow given that she was still in his arms. "And your investigator committed to putting me in prison," Leo countered. "Doesn't change the fact that I've never wanted anyone the way I want you. Doesn't change the fascination and respect and genuine connection that's been building between us despite every logical reason it shouldn't exist. Doesn't change the fact that you feel it too, even if admitting it terrifies you." He was right. About all of it. And that terrified Evelyn more than any danger she'd faced in 15 years of forensic investigation. "I need time," she finally said, pulling reluctantly out of his embrace. "Need to process everything, the photographs, the community center, this thing between us that absolutely cannot exist but apparently does anyway. I can't make decisions about justice and duty and what I want when I'm standing here with you overwhelming my judgment." "Take all the time you need," Leo said, though his reluctance to let her go was obvious. "But know this, Dr. Reed, regardless of what you decide about pursuing your investigation, regardless of whether you ultimately use that evidence to arrest me, regardless of how this ends, I'm not letting you go. You've become too important to me. Too fascinating. Too absolutely essential to my life in ways I never expected when this started." "That's not your decision to make," Evelyn protested. "No," Leo agreed with dangerous smile. "But it's my reality regardless. You're mine, Evelyn. Whether you accept that or fight it or run from it. Mine in ways that transcend hunter and prey, investigator and criminal, any simple category you want to apply. And eventually, you're going to have to decide whether you're going to embrace that reality or destroy both of us trying to deny it." The driver finally cleared his throat uncomfortably, reminding them both that they were standing in public having deeply personal conversation, and Leo stepped back with visible effort at regaining control. "Let me take you home," he said. "Give you space to think. And when you're ready to talk about what happens next, you know how to reach me." The drive back to Evelyn's apartment was silent, both of them processing what had just happened and what it meant for the impossible situation they'd created. When they finally arrived, Leo walked her to her door despite her protests, kissed her one more time with devastating thoroughness, and then disappeared into the night, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and the evidence that could destroy him sitting on her kitchen table. Evelyn entered her apartment, locked all 3 deadbolts, and immediately pulled out her laptop to begin writing report that should have been straightforward professional documentation of evidence received. But her fingers froze over the keyboard as she tried to articulate what she'd learned, not just the photographs that proved Leonardo Rossi's criminal activity, but the context that complicated simple narrative of villain who needed to be stopped. She was compromised. Emotionally invested in man she should be treating as simple subject of investigation. Intellectually fascinated by someone who could build criminal empire and community support simultaneously. Physically attracted to predator who'd kissed her like she was simultaneously the most dangerous and most valuable thing in his world. And underneath all of that complexity was bone-deep certainty that she'd just crossed line that she could never uncross. That whatever happened next, whether she arrested him or walked away from her investigation or found some impossible third option, her life had fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond professional considerations. She was in love with Leonardo Rossi. Or something close enough to love that distinction didn't matter. Was in love with man who'd killed people and saved lives and challenged every belief she'd built her career on. Was in love with her prey, which made her the worst kind of compromised investigator and possibly the world's biggest fool. But she couldn't deny it. Couldn't pretend that what she felt was simple attraction or intellectual curiosity or any other explanation that would let her maintain professional objectivity. She was in love with him. And that changed absolutely everything. The file delivery that arrived an hour later slipped under her door with the kind of smooth efficiency that suggested Leo's people had been watching her building, contained single sheet of paper with 3 lines written in handwriting she recognized from the earlier note. I'm not losing you. Even if you destroy me. Even if this ends with handcuffs and prison sentence. You're already mine, Evelyn. Choose your side before it's too late. Beneath it was a second note in different handwriting, typed rather than written. Evidence of massacre at warehouse 6 months ago. Leonardo Rossi personally authorized. 12 victims, all unarmed. Proof he's not the complicated gray area criminal you want him to be. Decide whether love matters more than justice. Anonymous concerned citizen. Evelyn spread the new evidence beside the photographs Leo had sent earlier and stared at proof that he'd ordered, possibly personally executed, massacre of unarmed people. Evidence that demolished any remaining illusion that his criminality was somehow justified by community support or complicated circumstances. He'd given her photographs that complicated her view of him. Someone else had now given her evidence that should simplify it back to straightforward monster who needed to be stopped. And Evelyn sat between those two realities, staring at evidence that told completely different stories about the same man, trying to decide whether justice required his destruction or whether love had already made that choice impossible. The hunt was over. The prey was caught, or possibly the hunter was. And Evelyn Reed, brilliant forensic investigator who'd spent 15 years believing in objective truth and clear evidence, finally understood that some truths existed in spaces between certainty where evidence couldn't guide her and justice didn't have neat answers. She had to choose. And whatever choice she made would define not just the rest of her career, but the rest of her life. Did the collision between hunter and prey leave you breathless? If you're captivated by the dangerous dance between Dr. Evelyn Reed and Leonardo Rossi, where evidence meets emotion, justice collides with desire, and the line between right and wrong blurs into something beautifully complicated, you're not alone. Want to know what Evelyn decides? Whether she chooses duty over desire, justice over love, or finds an impossible third path that lets her keep both her integrity and the man who's become essential to her existence. Craving more morally complex romance? Stories where the villain isn't simply evil, where the hero isn't purely good, and where love exists in the messy gray spaces that make us question everything we thought we believed about right and wrong. Let me know in the comments. Should Evelyn arrest Leo and lose him forever? Should she abandon her investigation and embrace the dangerous love they've found? Or is there a third option that lets her have both justice and the man who's captured her heart? Your voice matters. Tell me which ending you'd choose, and maybe, just maybe, Evelyn's story will continue in ways that honor the impossible complexity of loving someone you're supposed to destroy. Subscribe so you never miss the next chapter in this world of forensic evidence, criminal empires, and love that refuses to follow the rules. Because sometimes the most important evidence is what the heart discovers when logic fails.